Chapter 7 of Captain John Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dave Capper. Captain John Smith by C.H. Forbes-Lindsay. Some Stratagem. John marches with the army against the Turks. Helps the commander-in-chief out of a dilemma. The signal message with torches. At the alarm, Sally U. John's dummy battalions of matchlock men deceive the enemy. Baron Kissel attacks the Turkish army and routs it with great slaughter. The campaign in Transylvania. Alba Regalis is attacked. John devises a scheme for entering the city. His fiery dragons work havoc within the walls. The place is taken by assault after a fierce fight. 60,000 Moslems advance to retake it. John is promoted. John's brief experiences in Holland had merely served to whet his appetite for soldiering. He was now in a fair way to see fighting of the hardest kind. The year 1601 was drawing to a close. It had been distinguished by constant conflict of the fiercest description between the Christian and Turkish armies, with the advantage on the whole on the side of the latter. The Turks had ravaged Hungary, had recently taken important stronghold of Caniza, and were threatening Oberlimbach. Lord Ebersberg was dispatched to the defense of that place with a small force, whilst Baron Kissel followed as soon as possible with an additional body of 10,000 men, including the Earl of Meldrich's regiment. The Baron arrived to find that, although Ebersberg had contrived to enter the town, its investment was now completed by an army of 20,000 Turks, which effectually shut out the intended reinforcement. The situation was extremely critical, for Oberlimbach is but a few miles to the north of Caniza, whence a force of the enemy might issue at any time and attack the Baron in the rear. Prompt action was absolutely necessary, but how to act was difficult to decide upon. To retreat would be to abandon the town and its garrison to certain capture. To openly attack a strong posted army of twice its strength appeared too hazardous for consideration by the commander. However, something had to be done, and that right quickly, so it was determined to make an assault under cover of night when the advantage of numbers would be somewhat lessened. Indeed, if the cooperation of the garrison could be secured under such circumstances, the chances of success would be considerable. But how to communicate with Lord Ebersberg was beyond Baron Kissel's conception, for it was practically impossible to pass through the Turkish lines. These matters were discussed in the Council of Principal Officers, and when he returned to his tent, the Earl of Meldrich explained the situation to the young ensign who was upon his staff, and of whose good sense and knowledge he began to entertain a high estimate. When John understood the dilemma in which the commander-in-chief was placed, he expressed a belief that he could convey a message to Lord Ebersberg, provided it was short and simple. To the astonished Earl, he related his conversation with the German general on the subject of signaling, which had not yet found a place in the tactics of European armies. John had no doubt that Lord Ebersberg would remember the simple code of signals which he had suggested to him, since he had shown a keen interest in the matter. The Earl immediately informed the commander-in-chief of his young subordinate's idea, and the Baron wrote a message which was, if possible, to be transmitted to the garrison. As soon as darkness had set in, John, accompanied by the principal officers of the army, who were of course deeply interested in the trial, made his way to the top of a hill which overlooked the town. He was supplied with a number of torches, by means of which he proposed to send to Lord Ebersberg the following dispatch. Tomorrow at night I will charge on the east. At the alarm, Sally U. Kissel. As a first step, which would answer to the call-up signal of modern heliographers, 3 lighted torches were fixed at equal distances apart and left exposed, awaiting the answer from the other end to indicate that the signal was understood and that the receivers were on the alert to take the message. The minutes lengthened into a quarter hour, into a half, and at length a full hour had slowly dragged by without any sign from the garrison. The torches burnt low, and the disappointed officers turned to leave the spot. A captain laughed derisively, but was sternly checked by the Earl of Meldrich. "The fault is not with the lad," he said. "He hath done his part, but I fear the essay goes for naught." "Nay," replied John promptly, "Lord Ebersberg hath not seen my lights, else he would have understood. Yonder sentries be dullards. The next relief may bring one of sharper wit, and the general will surely make the round of the ramparts before he seeks his couch. I keep my torches burning, though it be through the night." With that, he set up 3 fresh lights and folded his arms with an air of quiet determination. The young soldier's confidence infected his colonel, and though the others departed hopeless of the experiment, the Earl remained with John. They had not long to wait for a reward of their patience. Hardly had the party of doubters reached the bottom of the hill when the 3 torches set in a row appeared upon the ramparts of the besieged town. They were surely in answer to his signal. But in order to be certain, John lowered his lights. The others were immediately lowered and again set up in response to a similar action on his part. He now proceeded to send the message in German, which was the native language of the general, and the tongue in which he had conversed with John. The letters of the alphabet were indicated in a very simple manner, and on the principle that is employed at this day in heliographing, or in signaling with lamps. 2 of the standing lights were extinguished. The letters were made by alternately showing and hiding a torch a certain number of times to the left or right of the standing light, dividing the alphabet into 2 parts from A to L and from M to Z. A torch, once to the left, would mean A, to the right, M. A torch alternately exhibited and hidden to the left of the standing light 3 times would signify C. The same thing on the right would be read as O, and so on. The end of a word was marked by showing 3 lights, and the receivers indicated that they had read it successfully by holding up 1 torch. At the conclusion, 3 torches set up by the receiving party as originally signified that they had fully understood the message. The dispatch went through without a hitch, and it was with proud satisfaction that John saw the 3 final lights displayed, telling that his important task had been accomplished with perfect success. The Earl of Eldridge expressed his delight in no measured terms as they hurried to the tent of Baron Kissel to apprise him of the happy conclusion of the experiment. The news soon spread through the camp, and whilst it made John Smith's name known to the army, it inspirited the troops with the prospect of support from their beleaguered comrades in the morrow's attack. Whilst the communication with Lord Ebersberg had greatly improved the situation, it left Baron Kissel still seriously anxious with regard to the issue. Even counting the garrison, the Christians would be inferior in numbers to the enemy, who were, moreover, strongly entrenched. Scouts had ascertained that the Turkish army maintained a complete cordon of outposts at night, so that there was little prospect of taking their main body by surprise. The morning after the affair of the torches, the commander-in-chief and his staff stood upon an eminence commanding the scene of the conflict, and discussed plans for the attack. John was present in attendance upon the Earl of Eldridge, and overheard enough of the remarks to realize that the generals were far from confident of success. In fact, Baron Kissel was anything but an enterprising commander, and his timidity naturally infected the officers under him. Young as he was, John had a considerable knowledge of military tactics, but, which was more to the purpose, he possessed the eye and instinct of a born soldier. As he gazed across the ground occupied by the Turkish army to the town beyond, these qualities enabled him to estimate the position and the possibilities of strategy with surer judgment than even the veterans beside him. He noted that the river Raab divided the Ottoman force into 2 equal bodies, and he realized that the key to success in the coming action lay in keeping these apart. Before the party returned to camp, he had formed a plan which he imparted to his colonel at the first opportunity. The flintlock had not yet come into use. Foot soldiers went into action carrying their cumbersome guns with a piece of resin-soaked rope attached to the stock. This was called a match, being used to ignite the powder in the pan. It burned slowly, and of course could be replenished at will. John's plan was to counterfeit several regiments of men standing with matchlocks ready to fire. The Earl heartily approved this suggestion, as did Baron Kissel, and placed the necessary men and material at the disposal of the young ensign. John stretched between posts a number of lengths of rope, at about the height of a man's waist. Along these he tied, at intervals of 2 feet, matches similar to those which have been described. As soon as darkness set in, these were lighted, and each contrivance was carried out by 2 men, and set up in the plain of Eisenberg, which lay to the west of Oberlimbach. To the Turks, the long lines of flickering lights must have looked like companies and regiments of soldiers marching and taking up position. Whilst the stratagem was being carried out, Baron Kissel advanced his entire force of 10,000 men against that portion of the Turkish army that lay on the east bank of the river. Upon these they charged vigorously, and at the same time Lord Ebersberg, with his garrison of 5,000, attacked them in flank. The Turks thus assailed on two sides, and being unable in the darkness to ascertain the strength of the enemy, fell into confusion and were slaughtered with ease. The other portion of the Ottoman army, confronted as it imagined itself to be a strong force, had not dared to move from its position and stood alarmed and irresolute, until Baron Kissel fell upon its rear after having completely routed the former body. The Moslems offered no resistance, but fled panic-stricken into the night, leaving their camp and thousands of killed and wounded in the hands of the victors. A large quantity of provisions and other necessities were found in the Turkish camp and removed to the town. Thus furnished and reinforced by 2,000 picked soldiers from Kissel's command, the place was in good condition to withstand further attack, and so the Baron left it, proceeding north to Kermit. John Smith's share in this important engagement was not overlooked. The Earl of Meldridge publicly declared himself proud of his young protege, and secured for him the command of 250 horse in his own regiment. Thus, before he had reached his 22nd year, John had earned a captaincy and the respectful regard of his superior officers. Winter brought about a temporary cessation of hostilities. On their resumption, early the next year, a reorganization of the imperial army was made. 3 great divisions were formed, one under the Archduke Matthias and the Duc de la Mercure to operate in Lower Hungary, the second under Archduke Ferdinand and the Duke of Mantua to retake Canizo, and the third under Generals Gonzago and Busca for service in Transylvania. The regiment of the Earl of Meldridge was assigned to duty with the 1st Division, and attached to the corps commander by the Duc de Mercure. Thus, strangely enough, our hero found himself after all serving under the very leader to whom the trickster Duprat had promised to conduct him. With an army of 30,000, 1/3 of whom were Frenchmen, the Duke addressed himself to the capture of the stronghold of Sulweissenberg, which was then called Alba Regalis. The fortifications and natural defenses of the place rendered it well nigh impregnable. It was held by a strong and determined force that bravely repelled attacks and frequently sallied forth to give battle to the besiegers. The Christian army cannot said to have made any progress towards the taking when John gave another exhibition of the fertility of his mind and devised a plan which led to the fall of the town. The young cavalry captain made frequent circuits of the walls, studying the fortifications and the various points of attack. He found that a direct assault could not be made at any point with hope of success, save, perhaps, one. Here, the defense was lax owing to the fact that a morass, which extended for some distance from the wall, seemed to preclude the possibility of approach. Testing this quagmire under cover of darkness, John found that it was not so deep, but that a few hundred men, laden with stones and logs of wood, could in a short while fill in sufficient to make a pathway across it. But they would necessarily have to work by daylight, and the next thing was to devise a scheme by which the attention of the garrison could be diverted from them long enough to allow of the accomplishment of the object. The bombshell had not yet been devised, but somewhere in his extensive reading, John had gathered the idea of such a missile. He set to work to make what he called a fiery dragon, and constructed a sling to send it on its way. At the first attempt the thing worked to its satisfaction. He then detailed to the Earl of Meldridge his plan for taking the city by stratagem. The Duc de Mercure, having consented to the scheme, the more readily since he had heard of John's previous exploits, preparations for putting it into effect were pushed with haste, for just at this time news was received of a strong relieving force which was on the march for Alba Regalis. 50 bombs were manufactured under John's directions, and together with the slings were conveyed to a side of the town remote from that on which the attack was to be made. Meanwhile, the Earl of Rosworm had gathered a force of picked men to make the assault, and 500 others with large baskets filled with material to be dumped into the morass. This body assembled in eager expectation of the diversion which the English captain promised to create. John had selected one of the most crowded quarters of the city for the destination of his fiery dragons, and he let them loose in the market hour when the crowd would be greatest. One after another, with flaming tails, they pursued their hissing flight over the ramparts, and, as they struck the ground, burst, scattering death on every side. The air was immediately filled with the cries of the affrighted Turks, who fled from the spot, and the groans of those who lay wounded and dying. But by the time the stock of bombs had been exhausted, the townspeople and garrison were hurrying to the spot from every direction to put out the flames, which had broken forth in several places and threatened to sweep the city. Whilst the defenders were thus engaged with the fire that spread rapidly in the strong wind, the Earl of Rosworm's party completed their causeway without interruption, and his fighting men gained within the walls and opened one of the gates before they were discovered. The besieging army poured into the doomed town, and a fearful carnage ensued. The Turks fought like demons and neither asked nor received quarter. Hardly a man of the garrison escaped. A last remnant of 500 made a stand before the palace with the Turkish commander in their midst. He counseled them not to surrender, and himself determined to die fighting. His men were cut down one after another, and he, sorely wounded, was about to be slain by the infuriated soldiers when the Earl of Mildred rescued him and made him prisoner despite his protest. Alba-Regalis, one of the most valued strongholds of the Turks, was in the possession of the Christian army, but 60,000 Moslems, determined to retake it, were approaching by rapid marches. End of Chapter 7.